Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Happy feast of St. Apollonius the Apologist. Now, you may have noticed that the eponym to this lecture is, of course, St. Apollonius the Apologist. And I would feel a little bit rude not giving you a short and brief introduction of who he was and why he's taken his name here. So, St. Apollonius the Apologist died on the 21st of April of the year 185. So this was a 2nd century martyr. And essentially his story is as follows. He was an illustrious senator, and he was denounced as a Christian, as many people were, because at this time there was obviously a lot of Christian persecution. Although in this particular year it has sort of subsided a little bit because of some bureaucratical and political reasons regarding the wife of an emperor who was more lenient to Christianity. But even so, Marcus Aurelius's decrees about the persecution of Christians was still in law, and therefore one of St. Apollonius the Apologist's slaves reported him and denounced him as a Christian. Of course, something a little bit silly here, because there was also in the decree of law a clause which meant that anyone who accused of someone, being a Christian and denouncing them for it was also executed. So I don't know what entirely was going through this slave's mind, but he was obviously he had his legs broken, was killed for his accusation. So Saint Apollonius and his trial was probably the most important part of his life, because it was what he did under this persecution that has elevated him to the beatific vision. Now, we take our sources on St. Apollonius the Apologist from 4 places. Now, one of them is the record of the trial itself, and this was given by the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius of Caesarea. There's also St. Jerome, who writes 2 chapters about St. Apollonius in his book De Viris Illustribus, which is essentially just a collection of short biographies, 135 of them, and 2 versions of the Passio of Apollonius. One was Greek and one was Armenian, and those were discovered in the 19th century, so not too long ago. And from those 4 places, we understand his life, and it is an incredible one. So obviously, he was asked to recant. To recant just means to repudiate or to formally and publicly denounce, in this case, his Christianity. And in his trial, he did something very interesting, which is that instead of recanting anything, he simply stood up and, as St. Jerome quotes, read a remarkable volume of very reasonable, delicate, and courteous apology of Christian virtue and understanding. This would be the equivalent of me, being denounced for sodomitic hate crimes and then going to my local council elections or whatever, or some trial somewhere and reading the catechism of St. Pius X. This is incredible. And it takes quite a lot of balls, if I may say so, and apologies for the crudeness, but this is really a courage which is unprecedented. Now, I will read one quote from St. Apollonius, and I will introduce the lecture. There is waiting for me something better, eternal life, given to the person who has lived well on earth. And I will leave you with those words from St. Apollonius. Mr. Taylor needs no introduction because we all know him. However, I will say that even before you begin to speak, you take some of my respect. The reason why is because this lecture is on the faith, on the virtues, including faith. And this is an incredibly complicated and interdependent web of concepts, which it takes a serious and courageous man to affront. So I ask for a warm and welcome round of applause, and thank you, Mr. Taylor, for taking this on.
Thank you very much, Dario. As Dario says, it's not a very easy topic to explain clearly, so I will apologise in advance if there's anything a little bit unclear. We are pygmies standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to our ancestors. I've had this explained in word and in books by far better men than I, who have a far more solid understanding, and my own rude intellect has been able to just about grasp this. I'm now going to try and pass that on to you, from which you'll get an even more rude understanding. So that's how this works. So that I can get a bit of help from above, can we start with a very quick prayer, if that's all right? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Saint Philip Neri,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. All right, so rather than going very in depth with one of the virtues, where have I lost my thing? Oh yeah, here we go. I thought I'd look at all of them and give you just a little bit of an overview. Okay? So the 7 virtues, 3 theological virtues, 4 cardinal virtues. Okay? And we'll start simple, but then we'll go in a little bit and look at each of them. So, faith, hope, and charity. Those are the theological virtues because they relate to God, and the object of each of them is God. Okay, and that's why we call them theological. And then we have the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Okay. I suppose the most important are faith, hope, and charity. They're also, in a way, or at least I find, a little bit difficult. They're the most abstract in a way, and they're sort of the most difficult to explain. So I hope you don't mind if I start at the bottom and kind of go backwards, and we'll look at each of them. First of all, a virtue. What is a virtue? The concept of a virtue predates Christianity, but we have our own understanding of it, which comes from the era which we call Anno Domini, after the time our Lord was on the earth, and comes from the Church, and is almost certainly best explained by St. Thomas Aquinas. The root of the word virtue, virtus, is what it's called in Latin. And virtus, if you were to look in a classical dictionary, that is a word in Latin. It comes from the word vir, which is a man. Virtus virtutis is the abstract noun. So originally it would have meant manliness, therefore it means strength, courage, that sort of thing. Cicero, I think, gives a definition of virtue in his time, which is the 1st century BC, and he very much seems to see it in those terms. It's about being manly, therefore it's about being brave and courageous, and so on. Now, obviously, our understanding of it now goes far beyond that. That's only a very small part that he's seeing. It's not wrong in and of itself, but it's only a small part of the picture. Okay, so a virtue, there is something essentially manly about it. This is not to say it's something only practiced by men and that women can't have virtue, etc. But that's where the word originates, and there is something of that in there. What is a virtue in our understanding of it? In the understanding of St. Thomas, a virtue is a habit governing human behaviour directed towards the good, which is to say, towards the true. And I won't get all into this, but true precedes the good, and being precedes the true. And obviously, in the end, that's God. So God is good, God is truth. And why is that? It's because God is being, which is a very, very, very infinitely simple concept, which we just can't wrap our minds around. This is why the name of God in the Old Testament is I am, because he's just being itself. Okay, so a thing has to first of all be before it can be true, and it has to be true before it can be good. Anyway, all right, as long as we have in our mind really that truth and good and being are really are very intimately related, they're really sort of the same thing. That, I think, will suffice. So a habit governing human behaviour, directed towards the good. Now, a habit, what is a habit? A habit, again, the Latin word for this is a habitus, which derives from the Latin verb habeo, habere, second conjugation, for those of you who remember your Latin, is the verb I have. In fact, this is the fourth principal part. It's the perfect passive, habeo, habere, habui, habitus. So it's a thing had, a thing which is had, a thing which is to be had. Okay? Which is important. I'll come back to that in just a second. A habit is something which you have. What else is it? It's something which we all know what we mean when we say we have a habit of doing something. It involves repeated action, which, because of repeated action in the past, it disposes you towards a certain action. Okay? It disposes us, this is again St. Thomas, it disposes us towards acts, and in virtue it disposes us therefore towards good acts. If we're talking about a vice, which is the opposite of a virtue, a vice is a habit which disposes us towards bad acts. Okay? A habit is a disposition difficult to change, arising from repeated acts. And it is something which one possesses or has, hence it being called a habitus. Okay? Now, a virtue is therefore a habit towards the good. It's a, again, St. Thomas's definition, a habitus operativus bonus. Now, habitus bonus, very easy to understand, good habit. We even use that expression today. Operativus means it operates. To use a modern military term, you might say it's what we would call it operationally effective. It operates, it's operational, it's a good operational habit. Okay? Why is this important? And I want to really emphasize this. There is a lot of talk out there, especially in Catholic circles, particularly about the virtues, and you can find quite easily online tables of all the different virtues and which virtues relate to which vices and so on and so on. One of the points I think that is quite often lost and overlooked, and one of the misconceptions I think that has crept in a lot all over the place, is this idea that virtue is something you do. Now, it obviously does relate to our actions, but strictly speaking, properly, a virtue is not something you do, it's something that you have. Because it's a habitus, you have a habit, therefore and virtue is simply a habit towards a good end, towards the good. So a virtue then, properly understood, is something that we have that directs our actions towards good. Okay, it's something we possess, it's not something we do. All right, if so far that makes sense, what we'll do, I think, is we'll go and have a look at each of the virtues in reverse order. So, prudence, justice, fortitude and temperance, these are things that were spoken of by the ancient Greeks. We were reading the other day Joseph Pieper, and he mentions Plato's Symposium. I think Agatho gives a speech about some of these virtues. Now, obviously, again, it's an imperfect understanding, but there's faith, hope, and charity being theological relate to God, and they're something which involve revelation. So they involve the supernatural. These virtues here are things which, and I think I'm right in saying this, I don't want to tell you something that's wrong, but I think I'm right in saying this. These four virtues, the cardinal virtues, don't necessarily require revelation, if that makes sense. In theory, a pre-Christian pagan can practice them. Although ultimately, of course, because the object has to be good, and it's God that's the ultimate good, they kind of feed into faith, hope, and charity. They are related to them. Don't let me give you the misconception that they're entirely separate from each other. They're not. Okay, they're called cardinal virtues, these four. And cardinal because again, another Latin word, cardo. And cardo, I think it's cardo cardinis, it's a third declension noun. It means a hinge. Okay? And the idea being it's like the hinge of a door, which swings outwards. The arc is very small on the inside of the hinge, and it sort of branches out, if that makes sense. So very often you can see there's quite a famous diagram of the virtues where it's like a tree, and you have faith, hope, and charity. You have the trunk, and then you have boughs, and then the boughs split into branches and into different little branches and shoots and tips. So each of these cardinal virtues, there are other virtues that are part of them. Okay, for instance, patriotism is a virtue. It belongs to the virtue of justice. Gratitude also, for instance, belongs to the virtue of justice. Chastity to the virtue of temperance, for instance. Okay, so you can go ahead and split them down into each virtue that is part of that virtue, if that makes sense. That's why they're called cardinal virtues. I'm not going to do that. Have a look. You can quite easily find that anywhere online, and there are a number of there's a few good books that'll have that in. But I mean, I could give you a diagram and a schemata, but I would just be sort of transferring my notes onto your page if I did that. Temperance, right? What is temperance? Temperance. All of these, remember, are things, habits that we have to do with our actions. Temperance, particularly, is to do with actions concerning the lower appetites. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it means two things: food and the sexual appetite. There's a link between the two. And I think it's not a coincidence that for hundreds and hundreds of years, all since the beginning, the church has required fasting. Specifically fasting. Why specifically fasting? Food and drink. Why? Because there's something about that in particular which kind of, we feel it to the core. And I think something has been lost in recent decades when you have modern churchmen who simply say, oh, you don't have to do fasting, but just give something up. I'm not against giving something up for Lent. That's a great idea. And you are also supposed to do almsgiving. I think the idea being that you save money. You know, if you give up smoking, then the money you would have saved on a pack of fags every day, you can give it to the homeless guy. That's the idea behind that. Much as giving up smoking or whatever it might be is a great thing, you know, I enjoy listening to classical music, so I won't listen to classical music for all of Lent. That's great, but it's not really a substitute for fasting, because fasting involves food. Listening to classical music, for instance, appeals more to the intellect. And here's, I think, I'm not going to be able to fully make you understand this because I don't fully understand it myself, but here's my understanding of it. What's the link between the two? Anything to do with sex or chastity on the one hand and food on the other hand. Well, on the one hand, it relates to which of the five senses? I think we would say touch, almost certainly. With food, which of the 5 senses does it relate to? And most people would probably say taste. But in fact, I think the answer is also touch. What is it about food that we enjoy? We do enjoy the taste, and it's part of God's goodness to us, which he didn't have to do, that he gave us this wonderful range of tastes and textures and so on to make eating interesting and fun. Really all we're doing is refueling the body, and there's no reason why God had to do that for us. It could have just been like refueling a car. There could have been one type of food and it tastes like white bread. And then eating would be a chore, and you'd have to force yourself to do it. Oh, I'm about to waste away, I guess I better eat something. That could have been what it's like. But it's not. It's a wonderful thing, eating, because God has given us all of these tastes and textures. But is it really the taste and the texture and the chewing of the food that we enjoy? And no, it's not. It's the food sliding down the gullet. Imagine, for instance, going to a banquet. There's no reason why you couldn't just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. Whatever your favourite food is, roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, and beside every chair at the banquet, there's a great big tall spittoon that's about 4 foot high, and when you've chewed and finished chewing, instead of swallowing it, you just spit it out, right? Because you're not swallowing it, you're not getting any nutritional value, you can just go on eating and eating, right? Why not? Why has nobody thought of that yet? And I think the answer is obviously we would find that very unsatisfying. We wouldn't enjoy it. Let me give you another example. Somebody could invent a chewing gum that tastes of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Now that would be a poor substitute for eating actual roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, because my point being, it's not just the taste, it's the actual eating of the food. Okay, and there is something relating to the two. Now temperance also, all of these virtues you'll see, the modern mind has this very, very warped understanding of them because people in recent centuries have misappropriated the term. They've taken the term temperance and applied it to something it doesn't really apply to. Prudence is the big one, but all of them. Justice, you see that word used all over the place today, and when you look at it, it's just not justice at all that they're talking about. It's something completely different. Temperance as well, particularly the Protestants in the 19th century, talking about temperance. And in fact, temperance is not, there's an excess on the one hand and there's a defect on the other hand. Temperance is not, you know, you can drink too much alcohol and be completely blind drunk. Okay, well, I'll never touch a drop ever. No, it's good. God gave it to us for a reason, and you can drink usque ad hilaritatem, right? But obviously temperance, there's an Aristotelian mean in there. There's somewhere in between, which doesn't always necessarily mean right in the middle, by the way, but it does mean not one excess or the other. What else can we say about temperance? I'm going to consult my notes in my little black book. Yes, intemperance is the opposite. Quite often this is confused with incontinence. And very often in modern parlance, people talk about intemperance when what they really mean is incontinence. Incontinence is a lack of self-control. And most of us would call that intemperance. Lack of self-control is incontinence. Intemperance is more that you don't even try because you just have no idea what you're meant to be doing. Okay? St. Thomas says it's like a city. Remember, for him, a city is the same as a state. So for city, read country. A city that has a city that has good laws but doesn't enforce them, that's incontinence. You know what's good, you mean to do the good, but you just kind of lack self-control a bit. That's incontinence. It's like a city with good laws and doesn't enforce them. Intemperance is like a city with bad laws that does enforce them, says St. Thomas. Okay? Fortitude. By the way, these are all in the order of these is that order for a reason. I'll come back to that later on, and if I forget, please remind me. There is a reason why there's a hierarchy to the virtues, and it's not arbitrary. We're talking about habits that govern the way we behave, so there is a definite reason for this. Right. One reason I will mention why temperance is the last one on that list is that obviously, if you think about it, it governs myself. It doesn't really relate to anyone else. I suppose in terms of chastity, it maybe does sometimes. I suppose people do drink together and so on, but it really is involving what I do. Okay, fortitude. Fortitude deriving from the Latin fortis, which means brave, although in most modern European languages, fortis, forte, the modern equivalent of that doesn't mean brave anymore, curiously enough. In French, fort means strong. In Latin, in Italian, forte, you see written on music, fortissimo means loud when it comes to music, but originally it meant brave. So fortitude means bravery, but we could just leave it at that, but we need to explain a little bit and think about it, because bravery, again, just like fortitude, is misunderstood in the modern mind. So fortitude, the virtue of fortitude, governs how we act in relation to fear, and helps us to overcome fear, and the other opposite excess, which is it's audacia, which means our audacity. Audacia on the one hand, and timor on the other hand. Timor meaning fear. Audacia meaning rashness, or being overbold. In other words, not being fearful, but not being overbold either. Important point to note, fortitude, like all of the other virtues, has to have good as its object. For instance, a burglar breaking into somebody's home at night to burgle their house, does he have the virtue of fortitude? And the answer is no, because it's not good. It's not a good act. And he might be afraid of getting caught. He might be on edge and fearful, and he might have to, in some sense, steel himself. But that's not the virtue of fortitude. Burgling somebody's house at night is not a prudent thing to do. It's also not a just thing to do either. So one of the things you'll see with this is all the virtues tend to go together. We discuss them separately, but as though they're separate things. But really, in practice, you never meet one of them, or very rarely do you meet one of them on its own. It tends to be accompanied by all the others. So, which is why a lot of the fathers say, I think St. Augustine, for instance, says that you don't stand still. You're either increasing in virtue, or if you're not increasing and advancing in virtue, you're actually going backwards. You're sliding back, but you just don't realise it. Because all of these virtues either grow together, or they kind of decline together. They go hand in hand. So the other example of fortitude, for instance, which is a fairly obvious one, a soldier on the battlefield, needing to be brave, fighting for his country, and not being afraid of the enemy. He's not being overbold. If you charge into the face of the machine guns, for no good reason at all, that's probably audacia. That's not the virtue of fortitude, and you're going to get killed for no reason. Also, what is your goal? Remember, the virtues have to go together. So, is that soldier on the battlefield, is what he's doing just, and is it prudent? It's just to fight for your country. Obviously, of course, assuming your country is involved in a just war, and I think I'm not going to get into all of that. I guess you can give the benefit of the doubt for people who can't always know everything, but let's just say you don't have reason to suppose that it's an unjust war, okay? It's a bit difficult to imagine in a modern context, but let's say in the Middle Ages, for instance. It's a just thing to do, because I think can see why patriotism is part of justice, because I was born and grew up in it's society that formed me, and I benefited from being part of it. And therefore it's only right that I should be asked to give something back. And the state does have a right to ask individuals to lay aside their individual interests in the interests of the whole. So the state does have the right to ask people to die for their country. It obviously is a very serious duty of politicians to make sure they get it right and not throw people's lives away uselessly, in generals as well. But yeah, anyway, okay, so fortitude, it regulates fear, audacia, boldness. Okay? Justice, oh, sorry, also, that's primarily concerned with me, but that does a little bit more concern other people as well, I think. Yes? Okay. Justice, right. Justice, the definition of justice is that it's giving to each what is his due. Okay? It's cuique, that's the dative case of quisque, to each one, to each man, what is his due? Debitum, that which is owed. I could talk about this all afternoon because it's very interesting. In the Our Father in Latin, in the Paternoster, forgive us our trespasses. By the way, that's a very kind of bizarre, I guess, almost an accident of history that we've ended up with the word trespasses in English when we know it really means sins. But what is a sin? We think, modern people today think of sin as being, there's these arbitrary rules and God just says, thou shalt not, for some arbitrary reason. And oh, you broke the rule on a technicality and that's therefore a sin. In fact, no, you really, a debit, it's something that you owe. It comes from the verb debeo debere, which is I ought, must, or should, and it also means, when related to money, it means I owe. If I lend you £10, then I have a right to expect that £10 back. Okay? If you sin against some, let's say you steal somebody's stuff, it's all very well saying sorry, but you kind of have to give it back or you don't mean it. All right? The fact that you've sinned creates a debt that you're obliged to repay. And when we sin against God, we're now in the debt of God. And although we won't go into it too much, in fact, the debt is infinite because the majesty of the person who's offended increases the gravity of the sin. So if you give your brother a slap, it's not really a big deal. If you were to give the Queen of England a slap, it's probably going to be regarded as a bit more serious. Okay? If you give God a slap, he's just infinite. So that's an infinite debt that you can never repay as a human being, which is why our Lord had to become man and kind of pretend to be us and repay the debt as God while pretending that it's man who's repaid the debt, so to speak. I'm kind of, yeah, I need to choose my words a bit more carefully, but you understand what I mean. Justice means giving to each what is his due. When you owe something to somebody, that's a two-way transaction. So if you borrow £10 from me, you now owe me £10. That's the debitum is now what you have. That's the debt to me. I now have something that corresponds to that. I have what's called a jus, which is where we get the word justice. But it means a right. That's another word that's very much overused in modern English. But that's what it means. It means I have a right to expect that paid back. Okay? And the jus is also a suum, which means one's own thing, one's own possession. So it's not just a notional abstract thing, this jus, this right that I have. It's something I actually possess, so to speak. It's not a material possession, but it is something that I have and it belongs to me, this right. God made you, and he made you for a reason. And in order to live your life, and in order to get to heaven, there are certain things you need to do. But of course, in the background, you're going to need food, you're going to need shelter, you're going to need clothing. Okay? And it would be wrong, in a sense, for God to create you and then deny you all of those things. There is a way in which you sort of have a right to that. And somebody far more eloquent than I once pointed out, creation didn't come with name tags attached, which is why if you are actually on the point of starving, it's perfectly fine for you to take an apple off the tree of belonging to your neighbour in the orchard next door. Okay? Whereas normally that would be stealing and it's wrong. Because really private property, although it's a very important thing, in the end is only a convention. This is something very real, and it's something we've just kind of forgotten all about. people talk about justice. Does somebody have a right to this? Is this something that is actually owed? And if the answer is no, we're not really talking about justice then. And it's, again, thinking about its place in the four virtues, justice, I think you can see very clearly, has to involve two people. It can't be something that just involves me. So justice, more than fortitude and more than temperance, is a virtue to do with my relation with other people around me. Does that sort of make sense? Yes? Okay, that's partly why they're in that order. Also, temperance and fortitude are more sort of the base passions. Being afraid, is that something in the mind? I don't think it is. I don't think you can really say fear is just the intellect. I think it is something more sort of base, visceral, your fear of the flying bullets, or being bold. Yeah, I don't think it is just something purely in the intellect. It is something to do with the passions, really. Yeah, and the passions, by the way, let me just mentioning in passing, are a good thing. God gave us our passions. They get out of control and they need to be regulated, but the passions in themselves are a good thing. We mustn't get confused and fall into sort of stoicism like the ancient Greeks and Romans. I was told once by somebody who knew, because he came from this milieu, that the sort of Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox really tend to fall into that trap. They kind of view your passions are just wrong, suppress them. And no, that's not true. God gave you your passions for a reason. They have their place. Justice is not so much to do with the passions, it's to do with my dealings with others. Of course, and God as well, because God has a right to be worshipped. He also, by the way, has a right to get the credit for all the stuff he did. I'll let Gus tell you about that later on when it comes to evolution. But if God really made everything, then he kind of deserves to get the credit for it, and it's unjust that we're taking the credit off him for that and saying, oh, just things made themselves. That's unjust. Also, what I meant to say with the thing about you need the means to life, if you give a bread roll or an apple to a homeless guy on the street, we feel really proud of ourselves when we think back on it. I did a real act of charity. Actually, no, I didn't. I did an act of justice. I didn't act of. If I have something and he definitely needs something as nothing else, then it would kind of be unjust for me to just walk by. It would. So, yeah. Okay. Anyway, more could be said, but I will hurry on because of time. Right. Prudence. Of all of these, prudence is the most important, and it's arguably the least understood. Prudence resides in the intellect. Okay. So temperance, fortitude are more to do with the passions. I mean, temperance above all is really to do with the passions. Justice is sort of involves me and other people, and prudence really resides in the intellect. Then it's almost in a category of its own above those three, because it informs all of them. Prudence informs all of the other virtues. So prudence is the virtue by which we know what is the right way to act. Remember, a virtue is a habit of good action. How do we know what we should do? And the answer is prudence. So, for instance, how do we know if something is just or not? It's the virtue of prudence. That's why you don't see, as I said before, one virtue on its own. You see them all together. How do I know whether or not to be brave and fight in this battle, etc., etc.? Is it just? It's the virtue of prudence that's going to inform that, and what is temperate, and so on. It really is, and it's the object. So give one little example I meant to mention with fortitude is a soldier, for instance, that is given to, Joseph Pieper says this in his book, which I would recommend, by the way. Looks a little bit like that. The Four Cardinal Virtues. I think he was just a layman. German, and he only died in the 1990s, but he was writing in the sort of 50s, early 60s, I think, just before the council. But he's pretty good from what I've seen. I haven't read very much of him, to be fair, but he comes highly recommended from people who I would trust on that subject. If a soldier gets assigned a really dangerous mission, let's say, and he decides, he doesn't go on that mission in the end, but the reason he doesn't do it is because of a misunderstanding. He misread the orders and ended up not going. Is he guilty of cowardice? And the answer is no, because it's his object was still good, right? All right. Anyway, prudence. Let me put it this way. When it comes to prudence, what is prudence not? Prudence is not taking a long time before you make any decision about anything. That is not prudence.